In February 2014, Russia hosted the 22nd Winter Olympic Games in Sochi. The country had emerged from its Soviet-era shadow and had overcome the economic shock therapy of the 1990s to become an increasingly wealthy and well-integrated global economy. The country still had its controversies, but this was going to be an opportunity for it to show off its success on the world stage through the unifying power of sportsmanship. Unfortunately, just 4 days after the Games' closing ceremonies, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, kicking off a slow but steady regression from one of the fastest growing major economies in the world into what it is today, which is a petro-state crippled by intense global sanctions and an expensive ongoing conflict. Then there is China. In 2022, it hosted the Winter Olympic Games at the same time as its economy was recording the first year of stagnant economic growth since opening up to global trade and private industry in the 1980s. This marked the end of the single most intense period of economic growth in human history. Many economists predict that China's rapid growth and plateau have many of the same characteristics as Japan in the 1980s and 1990s, when it became the global manufacturing hub before its own real estate market bubble popped, its workers became less globally competitive, and the ageing population became a national burden. One of the other less obvious similarities is that Japan hosted the 1998 Winter Olympics at the same time as its economy was dealing with the Asian financial crisis. A downturn that now, almost 3 decades later, it hasn't recovered from. Looking further back in history, there were of course the 1936 Olympic Games in Berlin, which, well, obviously had their problems. Later this month, the French Olympics are going to be held at the same time as the heightened tensions in the country over a stagnating economy and quality of life sacrifices that are coming because of it. And since my own home of Australia is slated to host the Olympic Games in 2032, it sounds like a good time to ask if the Olympics are a predictor of economic downturns. So, is there a reason that economic challenges line up with the Olympic Games, or is this just an odd coincidence? What lessons could economies learn from these challenges? And finally, if there is a connection here, are these multi-billion-dollar national vanity events really worth it? Every year, the number and size of data breaches goes up. It's becoming harder and harder to protect your data online, and brokers buy this data and sell it to companies who will annoy you with spam mail sent to your house or robocalling you at random inconvenient times. That's why we've partnered up with Incogni for this video, because these daily annoyances aren't the big problem. Some people can gather enough data about you from different brokers to take out loans in your name or steal your identity online. This can be a big headache, but Incogni helps prevent this from happening by contacting data brokers and using the law to make them delete your data. All you need to do is grant them the right to work for you, and they'll do the rest. After I got started with them, Incogni found 89 places on the internet where my data was being sold online. Within an hour of setting it up, Incogni had removed 26 of them and was dealing with more. You don't need to do anything yourself. Incogni contacts and removes you from lists online to drastically reduce your chances of cybercriminals stealing your data. So, try Incogni now and use our code ECONOMICS at the link in the description and get 60% off an annual plan. Of course, the original Olympic Games were technically first held in Olympia, Greece between 776 BC and 393 CE. Suffice to say, the ancient model that the Olympic Games once represented, almost 2,000 years ago, scarcely resemble the modern event held every 4 years today. These games were jump-started in 1896 by a French aristocrat named Pierre de Coubertin. He felt this revival would serve a greater purpose in the realm of cultural representation, and with the help of the International Olympic Committee, which Coubertin co-founded, the dream quickly became a reality. 14 nations participated in Athens when it was reintroduced. Now the IOC recognises 206 countries and their respective national committees that participate in the quadrennial event where rivalries can be settled in a variety of different competitions. In a way, the Olympics serve a mostly non-lethal battleground promoting healthy competition amongst those choosing to flaunt their achievements and potential of their most skilled athletes. But as always, there are other motives behind this expanding array of festivities and the value it all represents. Basically, the Olympics has arguably become the most lavish spectacle for bragging rights on the planet, with opening ceremonies and facilities becoming more and more elaborate over time. In fact, from the very moment the IOC was founded, one of the ultimate goals was to find ways to radically monetize such a massive global celebration, though this wasn't an easy task at first. For most countries, the Olympics looked like a tremendous liability. A good example would be the chaos that followed Montreal's failure in 1976. Delays in construction and cost overruns for a new stadium resulted in $1.5 billion worth of debt for the Canadian taxpayer, which is a huge burden for any government, but especially significant in 1976 dollars, and it took over 30 years to pay off. At the time, it was an expensive public service that most taxpayers just weren't that interested in. But this all arguably changed when Los Angeles stood as the lone bidder for the summer of 1984. Not only was the US city able to leverage its position for better terms with the IOC, but its pre-existing stadiums and developed transit systems gave it a considerable leg up when compared to other hosts in the past. Corporate sponsors, principally US-based multinationals, were allowed to put Olympic symbols on their products, which were then marketed as the official such product of the Olympics. For LA, it was a great chance to embrace the new media and branding opportunities. So then, what exactly continues to encourage countries to participate in the present day, and why does the arrival of the Olympics often coincide with crashes? Well, for the first time since 1932, LA proved that the Olympic Games had the potential to be a profit engine and as a way to promote their metropolitan legacy with a $215 million operating surplus. After this monumental achievement, cities all over started to make considerable bids to show the world how successful they were as well, even if said success was founded on false notions propagated by misleading figures. Using this hubris, the Olympic Committee tapped into the growing competition to host the Games, and they now know they can ask for more and more impressive resources for their Games, generating billions of dollars with each campaign. They do everything they can to show collaborative benefits. One of the most significant examples would be how the IOC and host cities often advertise a large number of temporary jobs for locals. In the case of Paris, the 2024 event has produced approximately 78,300 organisational roles and 60,000 tourism jobs, and has employed 11,700 construction workers for the infrastructure developments required to host the Olympic Games. In total, the Paris 2024 Olympic Games have created approximately 150,000 jobs worldwide. Some of these infrastructure investments often boast lasting benefits to the country's residents, and the IOC often alludes to these on its website. One of them being the train route built during the 1964 Japan Games that reduced travel time to and from Tokyo. That, or various public amenities such as housing that's built for visiting athletes. In 2014, Sochi, Russia diverted $44.3 billion for the construction of non-sports related infrastructure. This is why, when looking at it from another perspective, the Olympics is a game in and of itself, focused on PR. Countries tend to host the Olympics when they're doing very well, like during periods of economic booms. They do their best to use the Olympics as a sign that their country is prospering. But this has made their situation almost poetic because they fall into the classic Icarian trap, flying too close to the sun. In other words, if a country is doing better than it ever has been before, it doesn't really have anywhere to go but down. Especially if that economic growth has been predicated on unstable industries like natural resources or real estate speculation. A similar statistical phenomenon happens with other public pissing contests like the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. To get that successful at such a young age, you need to take some major risks and be prepared to bend the rules, which is why so many Forbes 30 Under 30 people end up in prison for fraud. It's also hard to get much more successful than being a billionaire at 30, hence the old adage, there's nowhere left to go but down. And this fall, when it comes to hosting the Olympic Games, is dangerously steep, often not helped by the sheer investment required to host the Games, and they don't usually pay off like the IOC narrative would have the participants believe. Unlike the LA success story, getting the attention of the IOC these days involves a very expensive bidding war. In 2012, London spent about $15 billion to host the Olympics, as well as the Paralympics, and when a government spends money, its people spend money. $4.4 billion was covered by taxes to be exact when the London event under-delivered. Much of this is in the aforementioned construction side of things. The majority of venue costs for the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympic Games went towards the Beijing Olympic Village, which ended up costing China about $3.16 billion US. The competition venues alone in Yangqing, including the bobsled, skeleton, luge and alpine skiing venues, amounted to a staggering cost of approximately $442 million US. For China, this was a major loss, but to be fair, the event was held in the COVID years when the country was still implementing very strict nationwide lockdowns and travel was heavily restricted. So, a more generous case study would be the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympic Games, which generated $3.6 billion in revenue, but when one discovers that the cost of running the event amounted to about $40 billion, the image becomes far more bleak. Of course, the standard disclaimer here is that budget figures from China are often unreliable, especially if it would make the government look bad or wasteful, so it's possible these estimates are on the conservative end. Then there's the argument the IOC and embarrassed government institutions make regarding the new living spaces for athletes. Their media strategy is to promote the idea that these structures will be left behind for long-lasting benefits, but what the IOC fails to publicly mention is that they require a mandatory minimum of 40,000 hotel rooms. That was a tall order for the Rio Olympics in Brazil, which had to build 15,000 new rooms, plus they ended up destroying homes and pushing residents out of the designated property, which was explored in a recent video. And although Russia diverted $44.3 billion US for construction of non-sports related infrastructure that continues to be in use, their 2014 bid and construction costs far outweighed the supposed benefits. The debt and maintenance fees alone will cost the Russian taxpayer almost $1 billion a year, which is far from affordable when their current geopolitical conflict is taken into consideration. So why not just make the Games cheaper? The Games used to be a fairly modest affair. The focus leaned on the traditional value of countries coming together to admire athletic performance, far more than the marketing strategy. But as the Olympics has morphed into a major promotional spectacle, the pressure to one-up other countries on the global stage has slowly turned it into what it is today. The IOC likes to make the argument that aside from infrastructure, that tourism revenue is so great that the Games practically pay for themselves. But again, this is a small contributor to the reported revenue, if not completely non-existent. In fact, there is the argument that the Olympic Games actually have an adverse effect on the tourism industry. The The Council of Foreign Relations, or CFR, found that security, crowding, and higher prices that the Olympics bring dissuade many visitors. And while Barcelona, Sydney, and Vancouver all saw slight tourism increases, London, Beijing, and Salt Lake City all saw decreases in tourism the years of their Olympics. Of course, all of this might be a noble sacrifice, right? Sure, general amenities, hotel rooms, future taxation, and large stadiums burn a massive hole in the proverbial bucket, but isn't there still the opportunity for employment? Well, according to post-game investigations, the answer to this question is no. Another study cited by CFR found that only 10% of the 48,000 temporary jobs during the 2012 London Games went to people who were previously unemployed. The reality is that for a lot of countries, they know that these events will not be profitable. And let's be honest, not all major government projects are always that fiscally sound. Sometimes money is wasted on vanity and building up global recognition. A country like China in 2008 had a lot to prove to the world, and the Olympics was the perfect way to do that. What this means, though, is that any other country that needs to be a bit more beholden to its taxpayers needs to realise that it's competing against countries that are effectively funding a global national advertising campaign. Another thing worth mentioning regarding the construction projects is that once the games are over, countries and their host cities are left with the task of maintaining these massive multi-million dollar structures, that is, if they choose to take care of them at all. Just take a look at Brazil, a massive economy with resources rivaling many superpowers. Here's a fun game. Which is an image of Chernobyl, and which is an image of a less than decade-old state-of-the-art Olympic facility? The Olympic Games were held here in 2016, not too long ago, and yet their stadiums have fallen into a state of disarray. At this point, it would almost be more expensive to bring them back online than they would be to build in the first place. And they aren't the only country that has decided to abandon these expensive venues. Plenty of nations like Germany, Bosnia, and Greece, the country holding the Olympics origin story, all chose to leave their once top-of-the-line facilities to the ruins of time. But this is just the tip of the iceberg when one considers the social ramifications. The Olympics is a spectacle that is often more costly than it is profitable. This is a measurable fact. However, there's still the argument that Olympic advocates make about the PR game that is, if nothing else, a way to put your country on the map for spectators to see what you can do. The problem is, exposure isn't always a good thing. Making the choice to embrace the spotlight reveals everything, the bad as much as the good. The social backlash following the Rio Games, with the troubling contrast between the slums and the stadiums, was a total disaster. And the Sochi Games brought a lot of attention to Russia right as it was about to invade its neighbour. The 2022 Games in China also coincided with issues like re-education camps, strict lockdowns, and the protests in Hong Kong. Many of these countries with questionable models for governance buy the Olympic media bundle with the expectation that the world will see them as a shining example of economic triumph with a lasting progressive legacy. However, these cases show that winning the expensive bid often does quite the opposite. These kinds of soft power manoeuvres can have a real impact on global perceptions and influence over things like foreign investment, tourism, and even trade deals or sanctions. And this goes for other major globalised athletic events as well, like Qatar's controversial Football World Cup. Choosing a country, smaller than the state of Connecticut, came as a surprise to most of the FIFA fanbase for a number of reasons. They weren't equipped to handle such a massive sporting event, and their presence on the world stage was largely unknown at the time. Rumours of alleged bribery began circulating through both Western and Eastern media. Moreover, the small country with a notoriously hot climate inhospitable to players actually had to build a new city just to meet the requirements to hold the games, with hotels, underground transportation, stadiums, railways, ports and airports. Most reports indicate that this alone cost $6.5 billion US, with total infrastructure investments estimated to be $300 billion. Which might sound like a lot, but it's a lot cheaper than it would have been if they needed to pay their workers. These huge construction projects required a lot of manpower, which Qatar received from places like India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. This is where things got a bit shady. To secure a contract to work on Qatar's World Cup construction project, most of these people had to go into considerable debt. These workers from mostly poor countries had to pay up front to labour hire agencies to travel to Qatar, all for the right to work in terrible and hazardous conditions. As a result, labourers were thrown into precarious positions commonly referred to as kafala or sponsorship, basically a euphemistic way of saying indentured servitude, where agencies force workers to slave away in 51 degrees Celsius or 125 Fahrenheit heat for lower rates than they were originally promised. Now, Qatar didn't host the Olympic Games, however, the desire to be in the spotlight had exactly the same effect of drawing attention to the country's horrendous human rights abuses. Something that most people around the world would have been blissfully unaware of, if not for the attention of this global sporting event. So, now knowing the corrosive socioeconomic burden the Games bring to their hosts, is the Olympics some kind of curse, or is it just coincidental that countries that host it often deal with a crisis during or after the event's arrival? Are these multi-billion-dollar vanity projects really worth it? This might be a tricky question to answer, but based on all the evidence, there appears to be a pattern worth mentioning. Of course, there are plenty of countries that have hosted the games where nothing went wrong apart from maybe some government overspending. But if there are bad things bubbling away under the surface, the upfront cost and critical international recognition is only going to make bad things even worse. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.